Assalamu alaikum and good evening, everyone. It's fantastic to have you here with us, and thank you for joining on time. I know it's tricky on a Monday evening, but we really appreciate you making the effort to be here uh, for what is quite an important webinar, quite an important topic. Um, my name is Hanif. I'm from Muslim Votes Matter, and I guess at Muslim Votes Matter, we're all about being informed to be able to make a change, a topic which I know I've personally become much more informed about over the past year, and I'm sure that's not dissimilar to a number of you, has been the Palestinian struggle. But the more I learn, the more I realize how much more there is to know. It's my lucky day personally because we have two amazingly informative speakers here with us who are experts on the topic, and they'll be generously answering all of our questions. Before we continue, though, we must open proceedings with the remembrance of our Creator. So I'll recite a short dua, a short prayer, before we begin. إن الحمد لله نحمده ونستعينه ونستغفره ونعوذ بالله من شرور أنفسنا ومن سيئات أعمالنا من يهد الله فلا مضل له ومن يضلل فلا هادي له. Alhamdulillah, indeed, all praise is due to Allah. We praise Him and seek His help and forgiveness. We seek refuge in Allah, God, from the evil of our souls and our wrongdoings. He whom Allah guides, none can misguide, and he whom Allah leaves to go astray, none can guide. وأشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله. I bear witness that there is no God except Allah alone without any partners, and I bear witness that Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, peace be upon him, is his abd, his servant and messenger. At this point, I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands on which we all respectively meet today and pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. I extend that respect to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples here with us in this meeting. I'd like to make it known that sovereignty has never been ceded. It always was and always will be Aboriginal land. We recognise the past atrocities against Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples of this land, and that Australia was founded on the genocide and dispossession of First Nations people. We acknowledge that colonial structures and policies remain in place today and recognise the ongoing struggles of First Nations peoples in dismantling those structures. So many of what the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples have endured to date is recognisable in the oppression being committed against our Palestinian brothers and sisters and fellow human beings right now, at this very moment in time. While we are all joined on this meeting, at this very moment in time, it is still ongoing. We are indeed living in a tragic period of human history, and to share with us deep insights about the Palestinian struggle and related topics, we firstly have Rima Naji, who is an Australian of Palestinian heritage. She works in the field of education and is a lead organizer at Justice for Palestine, Meanjin. Rima is seeking to be the first Australian MP of Palestinian origin running in the federal seat of Moreton in Queensland. We also have Halim Rain, who is a professor of Islamic Studies in the School of Humanities, Languages and Social Science at Griffith University in Brisbane. His teaching and research focuses on covenants in Islam, the Islam-West relations, and the Israel-Palestine conflict. He has authored over 70 academic publications, including books and journal articles on Islam and Muslim issues. I'll pop a link to his latest publication in the chat in a moment. But Halim and Rima, first of all, it's lovely to have you both here with us. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks, Hanif.
Thank you.
And I think just before I hand over to both of you, before we begin, just a couple of points regarding housekeeping. As I mentioned, my name's Hanif, and I serve as the lead of both the educational and national event streams for MVM. I'll be essentially having a chat, interviewing both of our panelists tonight. And I know some of you have submitted questions already via email, which is fantastic. So thank you for doing so. I'll try to reflect as many of these questions and themes as possible in the questions, we ask of our panelists tonight, but you can also feel free to type any questions you have in the chat, which our panelists will receive, and they'll endeavor to address these throughout the evening, inshallah, God willing. So without further ado, I think it's time to get started. And I guess, how about we start with the topic of this whole session, why Palestine is still the issue. I might throw this one to Halim to begin with, to kick us off. I guess what we want to know is, what is it about the issue of Palestine and Israel that makes it so important, not only for Palestinians or Muslims, but to so many different people around the world?
Thanks, Hanif. That is a really good question. I think it has a lot to do with the fact that Palestine is an issue that emerged at the transition point between us moving from the pre-modern world into the modern world. And in the pre-modern world, the world was sort of governed by large empires. And in the modern world, we've moved into this period of smaller, what we call nation states. And all of these states are, just about all of them are members of the United Nations. In the pre-modern period, there was extensive colonization of lands, particularly European colonization. So Australia, the United States, Canada, New Zealand, but then so many parts of Asia, Africa, Middle East, pretty much all parts of the world were colonized by one or other of the European empires, particularly the British, the French, but also before that, the Portuguese and the Spanish, and later on the Italians, the Germans, the Dutch also were involved in colonization. Palestine is the last of these colonization, settler colonial enterprises. And it occurred at a point where this was no longer acceptable under international law. If you think about when World War II occurred, this brought in what we call the new rules-based international order. And it afforded sovereignty to the various nation states and so forth. And it instructed that relations between states should be based on peaceful relations. What we see in the case of Palestine is that this colonial occupation continued after this was not supposed to have continued any longer. And so Palestine, I think, for many people, is a litmus test about, do we actually stand by and adhere to the terms of the rules-based international order that are supposed to define the modern world in which we live?
Thank you for shedding light on that. I think one aspect of the issue, I guess that is always a tricky one to sort of get our head around, and a tricky one for people who are not Muslim or Arab or Jew for that matter to kind of understand, is whether the issue is a religious conflict. You mentioned about the colonial aspect to everything. Is it a religious conflict? And I guess the question is then, has there always been a religious conflict between Arabs and Jews, or is it more of a modern sort of conflict?
I think Rima, coming from Palestine's in well positioned to address that.
Thank you very much. And yes, of course, I am more than happy to address that. First of all, thank you very much for the opportunity to have me tonight. This is a topic that's very close to my heart, being an Australian of Palestinian heritage. So it's very important for me. If I get passionate while I'm speaking, just excuse me. This is just it's a topic of passion for me. And as you mentioned, Halim, as others said before me, it's the litmus test for our world. So I get that a lot. People, when they first know that I'm originally from Palestine, they just tell me this, well, we just don't want to get involved in this war of religions, etc. Well, Palestine is not about religion, and the so-called conflicts is not about religion. In fact, Palestinians have lived peacefully and coexisted between Muslims, Christians, Jewish people, and atheists, and we did not have a problem with that. The root of the problem is not a piece of land with two distinct peoples with equal rights to this land. It started with a racist settler colonial ideology, and that is Zionism. I'm sure All of us here have heard of it. So it started in the late 1900s as a left-wing ideology, by the way. It's nothing to do with Judaism, as Zionism was about finding a homeland for the Jewish people to express themselves as a national identity rather than a religion. And this was for a host of reasons, including the anti-Semitism that the Jewish people have experienced in Europe. It's really important to talk about this European disease that is anti-Semitism. It was not, as Arabs, as opposed to what we're portrayed a lot of the times in the media, we are not inherently racist or anti-Semites. Anti-Semitism is a European disease. And just to continue, I just want to put it in its historical context, because I think it's really important for people who assume that this is a war of religion and it's a religious conflict to know the history of it. So Theodor Herzl, who's the founder of Zionism, called for the establishment of a Jewish homeland in Palestine. And in order to achieve this, there were measures to be taken, including the promotion of migration to Palestine, the strengthening of a Jewish consciousness around the globe, and the acquisition of land. In the 1915, and this is something that you, Halim, touched on a little bit, when there was, especially that in 1915, when a lot of countries were colonized, Palestine was under the Ottoman Empire, and this was almost the beginning of the transition towards independence. There was a secret memorandum that was presented to the British cabinet under the title "The Future of Palestine." And the recommendations were endorsed in the Sykes-Picot, which led to the division of Syria, Iraq, Lebanon, and Palestine into various French and British administered areas post-World War I. This Sykes-Picot agreement paved the way for the establishment of a Jewish state. In 1917, it was the infamous Balfour Declaration, which pretty much pledged to establish a homeland for the Jewish people in Palestine. And it stated that it's a land without people to a people without land. Only problem is Palestine was very much inhabited for thousands of years. Not only that, but at the time, Palestinians were already in possession of a national consciousness and national aspirations. It's worth noting that Palestinians are the byproduct of rich civilizational interaction that took place for centuries, which developed this unique Arab Palestinian identity that was well before the advent of Zionism. The Zionists had a plan called Plan Dalet, which is pretty much acquiring as much land as they can to establish a Jewish home in Palestine. The plan put what Zionism is about, which is the displacement and replacement of the native population of Palestine, and it put this ideology into practice. The British evoked the absentee ownership of land, which it allowed them to sell lands from absentee owners who are pretty much rich Arabs who owned land in Palestine, but they did not live there. They used it as holiday lands or houses for them to spend some time during summer or during the holidays or the break. So they bought land and evicted the native population who used to live and work on that land. But they were only able to buy about 5% of the land by the late 1920s, which is in no way enough to establish a state. There were riots, civil society strikes, etc. My apologies, my daughter keeps coming in and out, so I hope that no one is distracted. There were riots, there were strikes, etc., and that led to the Arab Revolution, which ended in the killing and the exiling of Palestinian leaders at the time, which made the country ripe for graph with, especially that it was without leaders. Now, after the World War II and the Holocaust, it became clear that Europe wanted a solution to their own disease, and that's anti-Semitism. In December 1947, when the UN announced its partition of the land of Palestine, only 5.8% of historic Palestinian land was in Jewish ownership. Now, the UN gifted the Zionists 56% of the land. And of course, it was supported first by Europe, then the United States. Now, anyone with little common sense would ask the question, why would Palestinians accept handing over their land, their livelihoods, and displace themselves so another nation can live and thrive in their land? Why would Palestinians accept this? And it really baffles me a lot of the times when the media talk, when media outlets talk about 1948 and the partition, they portray it as though Arabs went into voluntary war with Israel and the Zionists. But anyone with little common sense would ask this question: why would Palestinians agree? Of course, the Zionists accepted it because they had nothing, and now they have a land to establish their Jewish state. Arabs did not choose to enter into war because it was voluntary for them, because they wanted to protect this land, because Palestine was part of this pan-Arab identity, and it was part of the pan-Arab independence that Halim just touched on. So yeah, the Palestinians and the Arabs rejected this settler colonial project. And I say settler colonial because it's a distinctive form from colonialism. So the British had a mandate over Palestine, and they were colonizing Palestine, but it was not a settler colonial project, because settler colonialism requires the resettling, requires this displacement and replacement of the native population. So in 1948, Israel actually acquired 77% of historic Palestine. And before 1948, there were a lot of massacres that happened and took place. One of the infamous massacres is the Deir Yassin one, where Deir Yassin was populated by about 750 Palestinians. The Israeli or they were at the time Zionist gangs went into that village, and the testimonies coming out of that massacre are actually chilling. There were women, children, and men stripped naked and taken photographs of. And the horrors of Deir Yassin spread across Palestine, and people who lived in villages were terrified of the atrocities and the horrors of Deir Yassin. So and those Zionists used it to terrify Palestinians, so that whenever they know that there are actually Zionist gangs coming to those villages, they would flee, because they were afraid of the same fate of Deir Yassin to happen to them. So yes, some people in Palestine fled, thinking that they were gonna come back after their lands are being defended. Some Palestinians took arms to resist this settler colonial project. In 1948, Israel acquired 77% of historic Palestine and displaced the native population, denied Palestinians the right of return, exploited our resources, appropriated our culture, and outright they're saying that there were no people living in that land. In 1967, they launched another war and imposed a military occupation on what's left of historic Palestine. I personally believe that it's essential to put this into historical context, especially that when anyone talks about the future of Palestine, we always hear those things about peace talks, so-called peace talks, like from Madrid to Paris to Oslo to Camp David. They all failed. The reason they all failed is this: justice was absent in all of them. We as Palestinians were and are still expected to be bargaining to settle the so-called conflict. Azmi Bishara, the Palestinian author and the Palestinian thinker, said in his book, Palestine Matters of Truth and Justice, he said something very important. He said that the future of Palestine is not a dilemma awaiting creative policy solutions, but rather a question of injustice that can only be resolved through the application of justice. And I'll just leave it there.
And if I might, as thorough as that response was, I might just add one point here, and that is that for some people, they will say this is a religious conflict because God promised the land to the children of Israel. And there was a covenant with Abraham and so forth and his descendants. I think what needs to be understood, and many Jews understand this, and Christians as well, and of course Muslims understand this point, that is, there's no such thing as a covenant without conditions. So you don't just get a covenant to a land without conditions about how you treat the inhabitants of that land, and that's clear from Christian, Jewish, and Muslim sources as well. The point at which this becomes a religious conflict is, how do we respond as Muslims, as Christians, as Jews, as believers, as human beings who adhere to humanitarian values? And that is, when you see a people oppressed, we must stand up for them. All of the Abrahamic faiths call for protecting and helping people who are oppressed to alleviate that oppression. So it is a religious issue to the point where our religions tell us we have to stand up against injustice and to help oppressed people. Thanks.
Absolutely. Well, there's a lot to unpack there. Thanks for both your contributions to that question. First of all, Rima, I think going back to the beginning of what you said, please don't apologize for being passionate. That's why you're the best placed person of the best placed people to advise us about this topic. And justice is absolutely a prerequisite. So thank you both for explaining to us, I guess, how we've got to where we are today. Now, I'm pretty interested in what the international law currently actually says about Palestine and Israel, because I'm sure most of us have been following the recent UN vote to end Israel's illegal occupation in Palestine. What can you tell us a little bit about what that entails and what international law actually says about Palestine and Israel at the moment?
I think maybe we should begin with what do we mean when we say international law? So we're essentially talking about various legal statements, covenants, resolutions. So resolutions made by the Security Council, for example, constitute and reflect international law. We have other very important international agreements, like, for example, the Geneva Conventions. Then we also have rulings like those from the International Court of Justice. So when we speak about international law, this is generally what we're referring to: international, agreements, laws, etc. And so in the case of Palestine, what we would generally refer to if we wanted to understand what's the international law related to Palestine and Israel or the conflict is that we would look, first of all, at the resolutions of the Security Council. And there's about 300, I think 299 Security Council resolutions to date. We have about 900 General Assembly resolutions, but these are not considered generally binding international law, but the Security Council resolutions are. Then we also have the resolutions of the ICJ, the International Court of Justice. And for those people who have been following this quite closely, you would know this year there's been two very important rulings of the ICJ related to Palestine, one specifically in relation to the genocide in Gaza, and the other one in relation to the unlawful presence of Israel in the Palestinian occupied territories. So essentially, in a nutshell, what international law tells us about Palestine is that Israel's acquisition of Palestinian territory by force is inadmissible, and that actually goes beyond the 22% that constitute the Gaza Strip and the West Bank and East Jerusalem. You all heard what Rima's very thorough overview of the history just before. You can see from 1947, Israel has illegally acquired Palestinian land. It's illegally acquired because it was acquired by force. UN Resolution 181 that was passed in 1947 was only a recommendation. It doesn't constitute an international law to give away the land of Palestine to a state of Israel. I think people have to be very clear about that. So the acquisition of territory by Israel from 1947 onwards is actually admissible under international law. There's only that 6.6% that was actually purchased, but beyond that, it was acquired by force. The other thing that international law says about Palestine talks about Jerusalem quite a lot, the status of Jerusalem, that Jerusalem is considered occupied and Israel should desist from the changes that it's made in Jerusalem to the culture, to the demography, and the status of Jerusalem. And the status of Jerusalem that Israel has claimed is of no legal has no legal status, as the resolutions put it. The other thing is about the right of return of Palestinian refugees. They have absolutely a right of return, and other aspects of international law have addressed issues like the wall, the resources like water, for example. Those sorts of things that are fundamental to a resolution of the conflict. Yeah.
So then,
one more, sorry, Hanif, one
Yeah.
more point to make here is, and Rima touched on this, why have the peace processes failed. You know, it's going back to 1991 with the Madrid peace process, and then 93 with Oslo, and then the roadmap for peace and all of that. What the academic scholarship says about this is that the peace processes, or what Noam Chomsky referred to as the process by which the United States prevents peace, why they've failed is for two main reasons. One is because of the insistence on negotiations between two highly asymmetrical parties. And of course, you've got the United States as the broker for peace, you know, being wholly and solely on the side of Israel. The second reason is that the peace process has never been based on or applies international law. And so this is considered a fundamental failure of the peace process, that it doesn't recognize and attempt to implement international law. And so we're really left with a situation of might is right.
Mm.
Mm.
So that makes a lot of sense as to why we always hear that the international law has no teeth as well, I suppose, if people don't respect it and it doesn't form part of the peace processes.
Yeah, I'll just add one thing. So yes, Halim, that's right. In the when the UN petitioned Palestine, it was actually an opinion of that was voted for by 33 countries. At the time, the UN was was formed by 56 countries. 33 countries voted yes, 10 abstained, and the rest voted no. So the 33 countries, they thought, so that was an opinion. It was not, they didn't have a Security Council at the time. It wasn't a legal thing that means there is an obligation. It was the opinion of these 33 countries that they solution to that anti-Semitic disease in Europe, and the way they can seek justice for the Jewish people who were persecuted by Europeans is to give them a homeland that is inhabited by other people. So I think this is the crux of the problem, is that they were trying to seek justice for people who were persecuted by persecuting other people. It was just an opinion, the opinion of 33 countries. It was not a legal opinion or no obligation. And in relation to the International Court of Justice recent ruling, I believe it was in July. You're right, Halim. I think there are limitations to international law. I also still think it's very important to tie the behavior of Israel to international law, because what we're doing when we are chanting, when we say that we want justice for people living in the land between the Jordanian River and the Mediterranean Sea, is that for them to live equally. When we call for equality, when we call for justice, this is affirmed by international law, and it's a very important security for the people who are calling for justice for the people living in Palestine. And it states very important things. The illegality of Israeli occupation, the illegality of the settlement and the annexation, and the use of natural resources. And it also mandates Israel to not only end its occupation and to dismantle the settlement and to provide full reparations to Palestinians who are victims and facilitate the return of displaced people. I think these are very important things, because when we chant for justice for Palestinians, when we chant for all of these things, we get accused of all sort of things. I'm sure you all know about it. But when we tie the behavior of Israel to international law, this gives us a lot of security. Although like the application of international law is very limited, it's also very important.
There's an important point to make here. There's always a lot of criticism for the United Nations and for international law, and they're blamed for, you know, the deplorable situations that we witness not only in Palestine but in other parts of the world as well. The United Nations and international law are only as effective as powerful states will allow them to be. It's not the same as at the national level, where you have a court and then you've got law enforcement to implement the decision of the court. Such a enforcement mechanism doesn't exist at the level of international relations. Yeah. So the main problem we actually have in the internet with the international rules-based order is that the United States, being the world's, you could say, strongest superpower, defies the international rules-based order and international law, and allows Israel to violate, the resolutions of the UN and the decisions of the ICJ with impunity. So the problem is not really with the UN or international law per se. The problem is with the states, particularly the United States, and Israel. Because of course the United States is largely controlled by Israel when you consider the power of the pro-Israel lobby. And if people are interested in this, I'll refer them to a very important book that was written in 2007 by John Mearsheimer and Stephen Walt, The Israel Lobby in US Foreign Policy, and the most recent book by Ilan Pappy, which talks about the lobby on both sides of the Atlantic in the United States and in the UK. And that will give you a very clear understanding how these countries, particularly the United States, are very much controlled by Israel and the Zionist lobby, and why we can't get adherence to international law and the decisions of the United Nations.
That adds a lot of clarity. I think you may have partially answered this, but then you know how you mentioned there's hundreds of UN resolutions, there's ICJ rulings that reaffirm the rights of Palestinians to self-determination. So why is it then, if we take a look at like an Australian lens to this, why is it not reflected in the mainstream narrative and policies of the two major parties in Australia then? Is it for that reason? Is it because of our relationships with the US?
I think the relationship with the US has a lot to do with it. We also have to understand that there's a very strong influence from Israel and the pro-Israel lobby here in Australia on both major parties, the Liberal and Labor, and on our media as well, and to a large extent on academia and in other spaces. Perhaps not so much as in the United States, but it's certainly present here in terms of the influence on politicians and our media. And I think it's been clear to most people, if you've watched mainstream media in Australia since the genocide began almost a year ago now, I think that's been very obvious, the way the media has sort of positioned itself more or less on the side of Israel and has been quite uncritical of what Israel has done, in spite of the overwhelmingly horrendous nature of what Israel is doing in Gaza and the West Bank as well.
Thanks, Halim. Rima, I think something you mentioned just earlier was quite powerful in terms of you can't have peace if you sort of start from a position of injustice. So I wanted to ask you, the phrase two-state solution is always bandied about. First of all, I guess, what's your take on the two-state solution, or what solutions or models for peace and coexistence do you see as being viable given the current political and social realities?
Yeah, thank you. Look, I'm critical of the two-state solution. To me, the two-state is not a solution. It's a change of reality where Palestinians are expected to give up the right of return and compromise even further to achieve a state with less than 22% of historic Palestine. I just believe that this is another form of us Palestinians putting our rights to some sort of bargaining. The root of the problem is ideological. So I find it deeply ironic that some Western countries are now reviving the two-state solution, talks as if it's some groundbreaking solution to the so-called conflict. It's a distraction. It's another empty promise of authority, not a state. What we need is this. We need equality for all living on the land between the Jordanian River and the Mediterranean Sea. Equality. People who are calling for equality should not be smeared. We should not be demonized. What we're calling for is that for all people to live in peace and in just peace, where all are afforded the same level of respect, the same level of equality, and law applies to all of us equally. So name that. I don't know what to name it. I don't know if there's a name for this, the solution that we are seeking. But as a Palestinian, I see that what I am calling is not reflected, as you said, in what the two major parties are saying, in what the media is portraying.
I think another point to add to that is that if we look at the population between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea in the land that we refer to as historically as Palestine, today you've got roughly equal numbers, about 7 million, Jewish people and about 7 million Palestinians. And so when you think about this and you think about where did this idea of the two-state solution start, it really started in 1947 with this petition resolution, or it was really more a recommendation. And you can see how it was rooted in injustice. At the time in 1947, the Palestinians were still 70% of the population in all of the land. They owned about 93, 94% of the land. And they'd lived there for millennia. Now you compare that to the Jewish population. Now there was some like the Muslims and Christians were indigenous to the land. There was a small proportion of that population that were Jewish, and they were indigenous to the land. But most of the Jewish people had immigrated from Europe in the preceding decades, according to the terms of the Balfour Declaration. They were brought in by the British, and so. At this point of 1947, Jews were about 30% of the population. Most of them had only migrated there or immigrated there in the previous couple of decades, and they only legally owned 6.6% of the land. And yet the UN was going to give 55% of someone else's country to this immigrant settler population. So it was a fundamental, profound injustice at the founding of this idea of a two-state solution. And, and it's even worse today. If you think about it, when Palestinians and Israelis are roughly the same sort of population size, and one people get 78% of the land, and the other people, the Palestinians, are getting at best 22%. And now it's in complete violation of international law, because one of the most fundamental rules of international law is the inadmissibility of the acquisition of territory by force. So how can we accept for this 22%? It's not fair, and it's not going to lead to a lasting peace. I think which is why we see most serious scholars who write on the Israel-Palestine conflict know that the two-state solution is not just or fair or even viable. It's only really some politicians that keep talking about this. I mean, even the Israelis don't talk about this anymore. The current Israeli government has been very clear they're not interested in a two-state solution. You only get some Americans, Australians, and Canadians, and whoever British talking about it anymore. The Israelis are not even talking about it. But people who are serious about a peaceful resolution do talk about a one-state solution. And in more detail, they talk about that this possibly could come about through sort of co-federation. Like, Australia used to be, Queensland, New South Wales, Victoria, etc. And then we had federation in 1901. I'm a bit reluctant to use Australia as an example because it's a settler colonial enterprise as well. But I'm just using it for the example. So you could potentially have a state of, Israel and Palestine kind of equally represented on the land, in which people could be permanent residents of the other state, but perhaps only vote in the state to which they belong or are citizens of. And then, moving towards a situation where you have, a federation of these two states. Something like that is being talked about. And there's even been some survey research and poll data reflecting the extent to which that is acceptable to Palestinian and Israeli people. So that is something that is discussed. But I think one of the main obstacles to any peaceful resolution is the extent to which the Israeli population has been educated in a way that dehumanizes Palestinians, sees Jews and Israelis as these perpetual victims, and entitled to basically all of the land in complete disregard for the rights of the Palestinian people. That has to change. That sort of Zionist indoctrination that dehumanizes Palestinians and affords them no rights whatsoever absolutely has to change. And the international community needs to put a lot more effort into shifting the position of Israeli society from this very harsh and cruel, dehumanizing kind of thinking and language to something that is amenable to a peaceful resolution. I think the Palestinians are, very open to, various options for peaceful resolution, including the two-state solution. But it's Israeli society that I see. And if you look at the poll data and, electoral data going over the past 20 years and even before that, you can see it's increasingly moved to the right, and an unwillingness to compromise and find peace with Palestinian people. I think the problem squarely resides on the Israeli side.
I guess it's not entire like as unacceptable as it is. I think it's not entirely surprising though when you hear about how much the media is controlled in Israel, and the impact that can have on perception and mentality of an entire population is frightening. And both of you mentioned the media in your response to the previous question. What role do you think the media has, social media has, in shaping global perceptions of this conflict? And clearly, as you both articulated, there are many aspects of this issue which are misrepresented in the media, misrepresented by our political parties. What role do you think the media has in shaping those sorts of perceptions globally?
Can I go on this one?
Yeah, sure.
I had just a point to make, and that is it's probably over 10 years ago, maybe 15 years ago, two scholars from the Glasgow Media Group, Greg Farlow and Mike Berry, they wrote this book, Bad News from Israel. And it was an analysis of the mainstream media. This was a time before social media. And it was an analysis of the mainstream media, I think, in the United States, Britain, and I think Germany was the third country they looked at. And they found the coverage was overwhelmingly biased towards Israel, completely lacked context. And one of the most interesting things they said is one of the words that's almost completely lacking from any coverage of the Israel-Palestine conflict is, can anyone guess what that word is? Occupation. You cannot understand the conflict if you don't understand there's an occupation. And it's important that the most recent UN General Assembly resolution and the ICJ ruling talks about the unlawfulness of Israel's occupation of Palestinian land. So, this is fundamentally the problem. Now, when we look at social media, there's almost a democratization of media content, and there's so much more information available about the history and the reality and the international law perspective of the conflict. And so I think that's in large part explains why, for the first time in history, there has been such a global mobilization for Palestine around the world that's represented in it being a political issue in countries across the Western world. We've seen the encampments on the university campuses, and we've seen this extraordinary outpouring of support on social media. When you look at the various hashtags and the various indicators on social media, the extent of support in solidarity with Palestinians, that sort of thing, across the various platforms.
Thank you. Rima, is there anything you want to add?
Thanks, Halim. Yes, I just wanted to add that with social media, look, Palestinians are putting their lives on the line in order for the whole world to see what they're going through. And they're doing this for free. And when they do this, and I receive when I pick up my phone and look at those atrocities, whether there's images, whether they're footages, this will make me responsible, because bearing witness carries responsibility. It means that, hey, I see this and I refuse to look away. And this is exactly why people, especially the young generation, who have seen that people who are exactly like them, the same age as them, are actually out on the street. They're risking being killed. They're risking everything in order for them to watch and see what it means to live under occupation, what it means to live in times of genocide. So I think this is what social media has done. It provided people with platforms. The audience, then it becomes our responsibility as the audience, becomes our responsibility as witnesses to take this message and amplify the voices of the oppressed. And this is exactly what Palestinians have done through social media. Now, when it comes to mainstream media, of course, the coverage of mainstream media falls short of what's required of them, the ethics of in terms of the ethics of journalism. But I actually still believe that it's very important to make allies with mainstream media, because although yes, mainstream media does shape the attitudes and behaviors of society, but at the same time, mainstream media is shaped by society. So it's very important the work that we're doing, those the slogans, our chants in the streets, our rallies, everything, even panel discussions and webinars like these ones are very important, because all of these things are going to create the conditions and the pressure when mainstream media is finally going to convey the correct message about Palestine. And mainstream media is important because they have access to a broader range of people. They have access to a lot of the audience that we want to reach. And until we get them on board, our job is going to be harder. So it is very important to keep doing the work that we're doing. Social media is important. Independent media and alternative media are all important and all play a very important role. But let's not give up on our mainstream media. I still believe that there are people inside those organizations who want to take our message and amplify it within those organizations in order to shape and help educate people and raise awareness. Yeah. That's the point that I wanted to make.
Good point. Another point to add there is that Israel has long understood just how important the public and media narrative is, and which is why it's no mystery why Israel has assassinated, why it has killed journalists in record numbers, world-breaking record numbers in Gaza and in the West Bank. It's because they are desperate to control that narrative. They actually haven't got control of it because of social media. And another key indicator here is the level of threats and intimidation to against journalists in mainstream media over here, and across the the Western world. And if anyone's had any engagement with media, I have, and I can tell you from experience that mainstream media, the ABC, all of them are scared of backlash from the pro-Israel lobby, which is why they are self-censoring what they will report and how they will report on this genocide.
I think there's some really interesting points there in terms of grassroots activism complemented by mainstream media, social media activity, etc., and it all sort of makes an impact in different ways. I think that's some really good points being made there. And I think we experienced this recently at Muslim Votes Matter as well, when we had our national launch in Melbourne on the 1st of September. And yes, our movement is a grassroots movement, and we're looking to connect with the grassroots as much as we possibly can, right? But at the same time, we did invite media, and we did have media there, mainstream media there, and it was really interesting to see the coverage that the launch got. Which no doubt had an impact in reaching heaps more people, as you mentioned, Rima. So totally understand what you mean about the sort of complemented, how we need to supplement our different approaches. Another thing I think that a lot of people, and I'm sure a number of people on this call, have sort of participated in other boycotting efforts as well to sort of support the Palestinian cause. So I just, maybe Halim, I'll throw to you. Can you tell me what the BDS is and why they've told me I can't have a Big Mac anymore? Have these boycotting efforts been worth it?
I mean, boycott, sanctions, and divestment is a response to injustices where, if the powers, the global superpowers are not prepared to adhere to the terms of international law and conduct themselves in a way that is consistent with the rules-based international order, it kind of falls back on people. And so people have made conscious decisions to divest, to sanction and withdraw from engagement with Israel or Israeli companies and so forth. And it's seemingly quite effective. I mean, if you think about the case of South Africa when it was under apartheid, it was really the cultural and the other types of, perhaps even more so than the economic sanctions and boycotts, that made a difference, because it sent a message to the entire world that something very wrong is happening here. And if our sporting teams are not going to engage with them, and if our academics and our other sort of cultural entities are not prepared to participate any longer, something very serious is going on. Now, Israel has been able to resist this to a large extent. I mean, FIFA hasn't banned Israel, and many of the other sporting, they were in the Olympics and so forth. When, if you think about the way Russia has been dealt with, it has been, marginalized and excluded in those particular ways that Israel has not. But from what we're understanding, from the various reports that are coming out about the Israeli economy and so forth, the divestment from the tech industry and other sectors, this boycott, sanctioning, and divestment is having a serious impact. And if it wasn't, Israel would not be encouraging various states around the world to ban this sort of thing, or arrest people or put sanctions on people that support this particular non-violent response to Israel's violations of human rights and international law. Well, I think Rima can say more about this.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks very much, Helene. Look, in short, the BDS came about from the failures of the peace talks and the apartheid wall. I think the most popular peace talk between Palestine and Israel was the Oslo Accord, right? What a lot of people don't know is that Oslo was preceded by the First Intifada, which was a response to the worsening economic prospects for Palestinians due to the complete control of their economy by the Israeli occupation and the continued annexation of their land. So this frustration led to the grassroots mobilization of thousands of Palestinian women, youth organizations and youth leaders, like workers. They took strike actions, they boycotted the Israeli occupation. And this was initially it was very successful in terms of challenging the status quo, in terms of taking Israel by surprise, and also Israel commerce in the occupied Palestinian territories, that's the West Bank and Gaza, actually dropped by around 40-something% when Palestinians were taking strikes in the first year of the Intifada. Now, that first Intifada ended with the Oslo Accord in 1993, which led to the creation of the Palestinian Authority, which meant that this whole national grassroots movement thought that there is no need for them to take matters into their own hands now that there is real representation. Well, that they were wrong, and because that was not the case. Oslo was another failure that led to the growing frustration that led to the second Intifada in the year 2000. Now, important to note here that we're talking about peace talks, etc. And I know that we talked about it before, but between the period of 1993 and 2000, that's the period of the peace process. Israeli settler population grew by 73% in the occupied Palestinian territory. And also important to note here that Oslo did not address the crucial issues that matter to Palestinians, and that's the pre-1967 borders, the status of Jerusalem, and the right of return for Palestinian people expelled in 1948. There were other attempts to resurrect peace, Camp David, to roadmap to peace, etc. They all failed, being on Israeli terms, right? And here's the thing about having peace as a bargaining chip, if you want. Israel has no reason to give anything to Palestinians. It has the world's support. It acts with impunity. It colonizes, depletes resources. It kills the native population. It establishes illegal settlements with no question, with no accountability. So why would Israel give up any of these privileges? There's one bargaining chip, and that's peace. So see all of these uprising that were preceded by growing frustrations about the situation of Palestine, of Palestinians, and the absence of any serious resolution to the injustice inflicted upon them. We know they all ended with peace talks, right? And that the other thing was the creation of the apartheid wall, which, by the way, the International Court of Justice ruled in I think it was in 2004. It ruled that the construction was in violation of international law. The ICJ also ruled that Israel will have to cease any operations on the wall and compensate families who are suffering the repercussions of the construction of the wall. We all know what happened Israel did not comply. Israel built the wall despite its illegality, right? So in July 2005, a group of Palestinian civil organizations, I think there were around 140 of those Palestinian civil organizations, called for this BDS, boycott, divestment, and sanctions. Civil society here refers to all non-state organizations, from trade unions, from faith-based communities, from student organizations, social justice movements, etc. The response was overwhelming because it pointed to a strategy of non-violence and international solidarity that was inspired by, as Halim said, the successful transition from apartheid South Africa. Now, this unified call was based on 3 demands, and I think it's really important to spell out these demands. It's first of all, it talks about ending the Israeli occupation and ending its colonization of all Arab lands. And dismantling the wall. They called to recognize the fundamental rights of the Arab Palestinian citizens of Israel to full equality, and also to respect and promote the rights of Palestinian refugees to return to their homes and properties as stipulated in the UN Resolution 194. So remember all those buzzwords with Oslo, Camp David, roadmap, etc. The buzzwords were negotiations, peace talks, conflict, all of these words that give an illusion of a power balance. Now, the discourse with the BDS shifts it from peace to rights. And this discourse of peace process, because look, the discourse, when we talk about peace process, etc., it only accommodates for the Israeli case, especially when they ignore the main issues that matter to Palestinians: the right of return, the future of Jerusalem, the future of settlements. To the whole world, those peace processes might make sense, might be reasonable, might ask, what do these Palestinians want more than that? What the BDS did is that it highlighted the language of rights, of inequality, of occupation, Palestinian refugees. These are the things that are rarely recognized in the context of Israel-Palestine. It connects, that's exactly what it did. It connects the behavior of Israel to international law, and it challenged its status as democracy. And I think this is one of the crucial components of the BDS, is the discourse that it shifted when it came to the Israeli-Palestine context, because it's a discourse, these are words and concepts that were absent from the discourse of the Israeli-Palestine conflict.
Well, thank you. Thanks. That's very enlightening. I thought they were just telling me to stop eating burgers and stuff, but that's a lot of great background there. I think
also stopping to eat burgers is also a very good thing.
It's good for your health.
Having that moral choice actually is very, very important. Some people think that, what's this going to do? I think it's important for us as human beings to know that we are doing something in times of genocide and in times of injustice. I know that with BDS, they are more of targeted boycotts, so that the effects can be overwhelming, such as targeted campaign against Puma when they used to sponsor the Israeli football team, and that was successful. But at the same time, because it's about a moral choice, it gives people the power and the tool, the peaceful tool to choose which side they're on. Absolutely,
yeah, it's very, very symbolic in that regard as well, and has practical impacts as well, definitely. I'm sure many people on this call share the same sentiment. I'm happy to boycott as much as I possibly can, following the guidance of BDS. But man, I'm happy to share on social media. I'm happy to do whatever I can, support Muslim Words Matter in their activities, etc., etc. But I do have to ask a question, Rima, before we finish today. It can all seem very, very disheartening when you, I guess, see sort of the media narratives that are spun, and you hear a politician speak, etc. And I think one of the most disheartening things, personally, that I've come across is when we look at the shifting geopolitics in the Middle East, and how there's a lot of normalization deals between Israel and the Arab states, etc. what's your sort of take on that, and how do you think it's affected the Palestinian cause?
I think Palestine has changed everyone, especially during this last year. There is no going back to the times before October last year. What we cannot unsee all those footages that we've seen, like on our phones. And I know that the appetite to resist, the appetite to take risks, the appetite to speak up has also increased. Now people they desire to be a part of this social justice movement that's going to change the face of Earth in the same way that my parents were a part of the anti-apartheid movement that ended with the fall of the apartheid system in South Africa. So people are now when we see all those footages and everything coming from Palestine, it's what we people of the world, we understand that or look, I grew up in Jordan, right? And I understand a lot of Jordanians, a lot of people who live in Jordan, and also in other Arab countries. We always say that the decisions of our governments are not a representation of our own aspirations. And we've said that so many times. And I know what I've seen in the streets over this past year is also a testament of that people are going out in the streets and they say it out loud that not in our name, we don't want to support genocide. We don't want to see those pictures of killed children. I mean, children, they are the most innocent of all people. They're the most innocent of all living creatures, I would say. How can we allow this to happen? The standard we walk past is the standard we allow. How can we allow this to happen? And also the understanding of, if we allow this to happen to Palestinians, then who's next? When we saw the device explosions in Lebanon last week, it was actually less than a week ago. I have not seen the call for accountability. And let me tell you something. I think that because we've witnessed genocide and we've allowed this to happen, we've normalized a genocide to happen, then other atrocities might not seem that significant, and that is hugely disheartening. It should not be the order of the world. I still question how is it possible that there are politicians, that there are candidates who are not speaking about Palestine, and how could you be standing up to represent people in a political project like this and not speak about Palestine? This is a test to the integrity of all politicians and all those aspiring to be politicians. Look, neutrality, people who say that we're just going to play it safe, we're going to be neutral. Neutrality is a belief and an attitude. It's a more, look, I think Azmi Bishara talked about neutrality as a moral position of no bias and no alignment. And then people call it an amoral position, which is the most ridiculous of all positions, because when it comes to an issue of oppression, an issue of injustice, an amoral position is an immoral one. Then it becomes our obligation, because us as citizens, we have so many tools where we can apply pressure, whether that's through our workplace, whether that's through social media, whether that's through joining social justice movements, whether that's through voting. Voting is a tool that we are privileged to have. It is a tool that if we don't use wisely, it becomes a tool for the oppressor to further oppress people and continue this cycle of violence. And I'll just leave it there.
Amazing, thank you. We might finish off with one final one, Halim, if that's okay. I'll put this one to you. Given everything we've heard, and given the work we're doing at Muslim Votes Matter, we're trying to provide guidance, obviously, for the community coming up to the federal election, as to how to use your vote really responsibly. So I think probably the final question I'll ask for tonight is what does it say about the position of political representatives and parties, given what we've seen happen in Palestine over the past 76 years? What does it say about them, and how should this impact us?
I think we have to reflect on the fact that we are all only on this planet, in this dunya, if you like, for a finite period of time, 60, 70, 80, maybe you get 90, 100 years at best. And throughout our lives, we're going to face various challenges, various tests that will define us. And it'll give us an opportunity to understand our character, and it'll give others an opportunity to understand our character and we theirs. And when we occupy positions of authority and responsibility, we bear heavy responsibility. I don't think the politicians in this country are necessarily, evil people, but they certainly have failed in their test. They don't only have a responsibility to us as their constituents, as citizens in their electorate, they have a responsibility as representatives of the state to the international rules-based order. And the two major parties have absolutely failed in this regard. The only party that we can say has passed this test have been the Greens, because they're the only ones with a policy that stands up for the justice of the Palestinian people. The other two parties, Liberal and Labor, have absolutely failed. And everybody who has not stood in solidarity with the Palestinians against this genocide has enabled this genocide. Let's be very clear about that. If you have supported what's happened, that's very clear. But if you have ignored it or excused it or even denied it, you have enabled this genocide to happen. And that's a reflection on your character. Every politician must know that we're looking for leaders who represent us as people, who have qualities of compassion, of justice, and humanity. And I think it's fair to say that, in our lifetime, we have never witnessed anything like what we have seen in Palestine. I mean, we're talking about tens of thousands of people killed. Some reports are saying well over 100,000, possibly close to 200,000 people killed. People being forced to dig their relatives and family members and neighbors out of rubble with their bare hands. We're talking about the obliteration of men, women, and children. We're talking about the almost complete destruction of every single home, every hospital, every school, every university, every place of worship, and I'm talking about mosques and churches here. And this has all been done with impunity, in complete and absolute violation of international law and the terms of the rules-based international order. What will future generations think when they look back on this? And every politician has to ask themselves, what are their children and grandchildren going to think of them? People always say, oh, what would you have done? What would I have done if I was living at the time of the Holocaust or the Pol Pot regime in Cambodia or, the transatlantic slave trade? The answer to your question is, what are you doing right now? What are you doing right now? If you are business as usual, meaning you continue to have the same relationship that you do with your favorite political party, the Liberal or Labor Party, take photos with them, go to their events, invite them to your events, because you're concerned about losing your privilege or your favor with these elites, that says something about you, and it's telling everybody else something about you as well. If you're one of these people who want to opt out, I don't get involved in politics, I'm apolitical, you're the same as the business as usual. You're enabling this genocide to continue. In our religion and in Christianity and in Judaism and in other faiths around the world, one of the fundamental principles or tenets of these religions is that you have to stand up for justice. You have to be just. There's a very well-known, famous hadith of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, and that is when you see an injustice or when you're confronted with an injustice, the first thing you have to do is stop it with your hand. If you're unable to do that, then you have to speak out against it. And if you're unable to do that, you have to know in your heart that it's wrong. Note that there's no fourth option here to say, you know what, I can't do anything about it, I'm just going to go along with it. No, injustice is injustice, and we have to be opposed to it, whether it's through our hand, through our speech, but at the basic minimum, we have to know in our hearts that it's wrong. And so when it comes time to vote, we have to make a hard decision about our political representatives. And if they are among those that have enabled or supported or excused or denied this genocide, they do not have the right to represent us. Anyone who has been influenced, whether it's through bribes, threats, or intimidation to support a genocide, which is the worst thing a people can do to another people, they can be influenced to support anything. And so we should be very concerned about any of our political representatives that would support or excuse or deny this genocide. And I think we have an obligation as citizens of this country to hold them to account and to not support any politician that would support or enable this genocide. And we have to change the culture in this country. We have to change the political landscape. We have to say to politicians that have a sense of justice, a sense of compassion and integrity and humanity, that you're the political representative we want. Thank you.
Thanks, Halim. I think that's a great note to end on. A lot of thoughts there that you've left us with, and Rima, we really appreciate both of your contributions tonight. It's been absolutely enlightening in a number of respects. Been very educational, and I'm sure everybody is enriched for the experience. I've just to everybody for joining us on this call as well, on this meeting. We really appreciate your support. I hope this is not the last we see of each and every one of you. I would love to get involved with MVM and the work that we're doing. If you want to find out more, please do visit our website, follow us on social media. I've popped the links in the chat over there. Get in touch with us. The volunteer links over there. If you can contribute via donation, that would be really appreciated. It allows us to amplify our impact as well. I've popped the link in there. And finally, there's a 2-minute survey that I've popped in the link. If you can take a second to complete that would be really great. This is one of the first webinars we've run. And your thoughts, your insights, your feedback is really appreciated, as it allows us to sort of improve and also strengthen what we've done well with this webinar. That would be really appreciated by us as well. So finally, thank you for joining. Thank you, Rima. Thank you, Halim, once again. And everybody, we hope to see you very soon, inshallah. Assalamu alaikum and good evening.
Thank you all very much.
Thanks.